58 years ago, a 4-year-old boy named Isaac Holt disappeared from the front steps of a general store in Casey, Wyoming. While his mother was inside paying for a sack of flour, leaving behind nothing but a scuffed leather boot, one boot, the right one, sitting on the second porch step as if he had simply slipped free of it and walked out of his life. Authorities concluded within the week that Isaac had most likely wandered into the open rangeland bordering the town and come to an end no one wanted to name directly. His mother, Ruth Holt, did not accept that conclusion. She did not accept it in 1966, or in 1976, or in 1996, or on the morning she died, in the spring of 2009, at the age of 81, with a photograph of her son on the nightstand beside her. What Ruth could not have known, what none of them could have known, was that her son was alive. He had been alive the entire time, less than 400 miles away, living under a name that was not his, in a life that had been constructed around him before he was old enough to understand what had been taken. It would take 58 years, a home DNA kit mailed to a senior center in Sheridan County, and a retired records clerk who refused to let a discrepancy in a 1967 school enrollment form go unexplained, to finally bring Isaac Holt home. But to understand what that homecoming meant, you have to understand what was lost in the first place. And to understand that, you have to go back to Casey, back to 1966, back to the last afternoon that was ordinary. Johnson County, Wyoming, in the summer of 1966, was a landscape that operated on its own set of terms. The Powder River country stretched wide and grass-pale in every direction from Casey, and the town itself, population just under 400, existed in the practical, unsentimental way of places where the weather has always had the final word. People kept horses, people kept cattle. The Methodist Church on the corner of Nolan Avenue held services that the whole town attended not purely from faith, but from the understanding that community, in a place this exposed to weather and distance, was a survival strategy. The gas station doubled as the post office twice a week. The general store, Holt and Brickers, no relation to Isaac's family, was where you settled your account on Fridays and caught up on everything the week had produced. Walt Holt ran a small cattle operation 12 miles out of town on the Powder River Road. He was 34 years old in 1966, a quiet man who expressed affection through maintenance. He kept the truck running, the fences tight, the water tank clean. Ruth was 31, the daughter of a ranching family from Sheridan, and she had adapted to the isolation of the Powder River Road the way some women do, by filling it with industry. She sewed. She kept a large kitchen garden. She made preserves. She had 3 children, May, who was 8, Daniel, who was 6, and Isaac, the youngest, who had turned 4 in March and who had, since approximately the moment he could walk, treated every fence post and grain bucket and discarded boot on the property as a personal discovery requiring immediate investigation. Isaac Holt was a child who collected things, small things, specific things that only he understood the value of. A piece of quartz from the creek bed, a pheasant feather, a rusted bolt from the equipment shed that he kept in the pocket of his dungarees for 3 weeks before Ruth finally washed them. He had a gap between his front teeth and a habit, when he was thinking hard about something, of tilting his whole head to the right, like a dog hearing a sound just out of range. His grandmother, Walt's mother Vera, called him her pocket philosopher. His father called him a handful. Both of them meant it the same way. Every Friday, Ruth drove the 12 miles into Casey for the weekly supply run. The older children were usually in school, but Isaac always came. He was too young for school and too much to leave with a distracted farmhand. That Friday in September, Ruth had a short list: flour, salt, a spool of white thread, and a pound of coffee. She parked on the main street, told Isaac to sit on the steps and wait, and went inside. She was in the store for 11 minutes. She knew because she had glanced at the clock above the register when she walked in. When she walked back out, Isaac was gone. The boot was on the second step, the right one. Sitting upright, not fallen, set down, or dropped, or simply left when a small foot pulled free and didn't stop moving. Ruth stood on that porch and called his name twice. Then she went back into the store and told Bricker to call the sheriff. By 2:30 that afternoon, Deputy Harold Foss of the Johnson County Sheriff's Office had arrived on scene. By 3, Walt had been reached by phone at the ranch and was driving hard toward town. By 4 o'clock, 12 men on horseback were fanning out into the rangeland east and south of the main street, covering the terrain that a small child might reach on foot in the time he'd been missing. The search ran for 9 days. It covered an area of roughly 40 square miles. Searchers found a fence post with what might have been a small handprint in the dust, 7 miles from town on the Barnum Road. They found a piece of blue fabric on a wire strand that Ruth identified as a possible match to the shirt Isaac had been wearing. Neither piece of evidence was conclusive. Neither led anywhere. On the 3rd day, a woman named Dolores Raines, who lived in a farmhouse a quarter-mile off the main road, told Deputy Foss that she had seen, on the afternoon Isaac disappeared, a truck she didn't recognize parked at the edge of the main street. A dark truck, she thought navy blue or black, idling near the hardware store for longer than seemed purposeful. She couldn't say what make. She could not give a plate. She said there had been a person in the passenger seat. She thought, though she wasn't certain, that the person might have been small. Foss logged the report. He drove the stretch of road twice looking for anything it might have left behind. He found nothing. The truck was never identified. On the 9th day, Sheriff Boyd Castile held a brief statement outside the courthouse and said that the search was being scaled back. He expressed his condolences to the family and said the department would continue to investigate any new information that came to light. He mentioned the rangeland. He mentioned the creek. He used the word accident carefully, more than once. Ruth Holt stood beside her husband on the courthouse steps and said nothing. She had the boot in a paper bag under her arm. She had brought it from home that morning because she intended to give it to someone who would know what to do with it. Nobody had asked her for it. She brought it home again that evening and put it on the shelf in the kitchen, beside the coffee can and the salt box, where she could see it every morning when she came in to start the stove. That boot would sit on that shelf for 43 years. The case was assigned to Deputy Harold Foss as a matter of informal continuity. He had been first on scene, he knew the family, and he was, by his own private accounting, not able to set it down. Foss was 28 years old in 1966. He had grown up in Buffalo, 30 miles north, and had come to the Johnson County Department 2 years earlier after a stint in the Army that had left him with a methodical approach to problems that some people mistook for slowness. He was not slow. He spent the winter of 1966 to 1967 running down every dark truck registered in Johnson, Campbell, and Natrona counties, a list that ran to 63 vehicles. He interviewed the owners of 41. The remaining 22 were unreachable, sold, or out of state. One name on that list gave Foss a pause he could not fully explain at the time. A man named Clarence Mabry, age 44, who had a truck registered to an address in Gillette, Campbell County, and who, according to the DMV record, had reported the vehicle sold in November of 1966. 2 months after Isaac disappeared. Mabry had no criminal record. He was described by a neighbor in Gillette as a solitary man who had, around that same November, relocated to somewhere in Montana without much notice. Foss drove to Gillette. The neighbor knew nothing more. Mabry had left no forwarding address. Foss filed a report noting Mabry as a person of interest. Unresolved, no evidence connecting him to the disappearance, but unresolved. The report was placed in the case file. No follow-up was ordered by the department. The case file was reclassified as inactive in the spring of 1968. Meanwhile, on the Powder River Road, Ruth Holt moved through the years the way you move through country where the ground is uneven and there is no marked trail, carefully, one foot and then the other, never looking too far ahead. She kept the boot on the shelf. She kept Isaac's photograph in the album and a separate copy, smaller, in her Bible. She talked about him with the older children in the direct way of ranch families who understand that loss, like weather, is part of the landscape and must be named accurately, or it becomes dangerous. May and Daniel grew up knowing their brother's face and his name, and the story of the boot and the store and the 11 minutes. Walt died in 1981. Machinery accident. Ruth stayed on the place for another 10 years before she sold it and moved into town. She never stopped waiting for something she could not name. She simply waited the way some people carry weight. Not dramatically, not with visible effort, but continuously, in the permanent background of everything. By 1976, 10 years had passed, and the search had long since contracted to one woman and a boot on a shelf. By 1986, 20 years had passed, and the case file in the Johnson County basement had not been opened in years. By 1996, Deputy Harold Foss, who had spent 30 years as a sheriff's deputy and retired in 1994, still kept a photocopied page from the original case file in the drawer of his roll-top desk at home. He looked at it twice a year. In March, when Isaac would have had a birthday, and in September, when the anniversary of the disappearance came and went. He had never identified Clarence Mabry. He had never stopped believing that Mabry was where the answer lived. By 2001, 35 years had passed. The general store on the main street had become a feed supply warehouse. The Methodist church had been renovated twice. The children who had been in school the day Isaac Holt disappeared were now in their 40s and 50s, and most of them, when asked, still remembered the boy's name. Ruth moved into the assisted living facility in Buffalo in 2005. She brought the boot. It sat on the windowsill of her room. The staff knew what it was without being told. She died in April of 2009 without an answer. She had not given up hope. She had simply run out of time. Then, in 2022, something happened that began with a home DNA kit, a coupon, and a 62-year-old man named Gerald Sweeney, who lived in a trailer park outside Sheridan and had been wondering, for most of his adult life, why he didn't look anything like the man who had raised him. Every case on this channel represents weeks of research, verifying records, locating witnesses, tracing a life across decades. If that work matters to you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We read everyone. Now let's get back to Isaac Holt. Gerald Sweeney had been raised by a man named Earl Sweeney in a series of rural properties across Montana and Wyoming, moving roughly every 4 to 6 years in a pattern Gerald had grown up understanding as simply how things were. Earl was quiet, self-contained, occasionally affectionate in the wordless way of men who express love through presence rather than language. He had told Gerald, when Gerald was old enough to ask, that his mother had died when he was very small, and that there was no other family to speak of. Gerald had accepted this. He had no reason not to. Earl Sweeney died in 2017. He left Gerald the trailer and a Dodge pickup and a strongbox that Gerald didn't open until 3 months after the funeral, when the grief had settled into something he could work around. Inside the strongbox were a discharge certificate from the Navy, Earl's from 1958, a small amount of cash, and beneath everything, a child's boot. The left one, small, leather, scuffed at the toe in the particular way of a child who drags his feet when he walks. Gerald had no idea what it meant. He kept it. He kept it the way you keep things from a dead person's effects when you don't understand them, out of a respect that doesn't require explanation. In the spring of 2022, Gerald Sweeney submitted a home DNA sample to a consumer ancestry platform, the same kind of service millions of Americans use to trace their family history, which allows users to voluntarily upload their DNA and discover biological relatives who have done the same. The platform connected Gerald to a set of second and third cousins he had never heard of. Every single one of them was from Wyoming. He contacted one. Her name was Sandra Holt Margrave. She was May Holt's daughter. Gerald's second cousin on a biological line, he had been told, did not exist. Sandra knew the family history. She knew her grandmother, Ruth. She knew the name Isaac Holt and the boot on the shelf and the general store on the main street and the 11 minutes. She called her mother. May Holt was 80 years old, living in Casper. She listened to what her daughter told her. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Get someone from the state, right now." Detective Sergeant Willa Bremner of the Wyoming Division of Criminal Investigation received the referral from the Sheridan County Genealogy Match Coordinator on a Thursday in August of 2022. She pulled the original Johnson County case file the same afternoon. The file still contained Harold Foss's 1967 notation about Clarence Mabry. Bremner stared at it for a moment. Then she cross-referenced Mabry's name against every available database: DMV, Social Security, property records, death records. Earl Sweeney, born Clarence Earl Mabry, died 2017 in Sheridan, Wyoming, 31 miles from where Gerald Sweeney was living. Records showed a legal name change filed in Gallatin County, Montana, in 1968. 2 years after a 4-year-old boy disappeared from a porch step in Casey. She cross-referenced Gerald Sweeney's DNA profile against the NIMUS registry, where May Holt had submitted her own DNA sample in 2004, at the encouragement of a missing persons advocate who had worked with the family. The match came back the same day. Sibling-level biological connection. Confidence conclusive. She picked up the phone. "I need you to come in," she told Gerald. "There's something we need to tell you." What followed was 6 months of careful, methodical work to build the full case picture. Clarence Mabry, Earl Sweeney, had died 5 years before the investigation caught up with him, which meant there would be no courtroom, no testimony, no sentence. What there would be was a record. A documented, permanent legal record of what he had done and who he had taken. Investigators reconstructed the route. Mabry and Casey in September 1966, his truck on the main street, his name on a list that Harold Foss had built with no resources and no department support. The left boot found in the strongbox, the match to the right boot Ruth Holt had kept on her shelf for 43 years, confirmed what the DNA already had. Bremner drove to Buffalo to tell May Holt in person. May was in the common room of her assisted living facility when Willa Bremner came in. She was 80 years old. She had lived with the disappearance of her brother for 56 years. She had grown up watching her mother wait. She had kept the vigil herself after Ruth died. When Bremner told her that her brother was alive, that he had been alive the whole time, that he was 62 years old and living 30 miles away, and that he had a boot in his possession that was the other half of the one on Ruth's shelf. May Holt did not cry immediately. She sat very still and looked at her hands for a long moment. Then she said, quietly, "She knew. She always knew." Isaac Holt, Gerald Sweeney, met his sister for the first time in the winter of 2022 in a conference room in Casper. With a counselor and a victim's advocate present and a box of documents and photographs that May had been keeping for decades. The reunion was private. What is documented is that Gerald brought the left boot, and May brought the right one. They fit together the way they were always supposed to. The legal outcome is this: Clarence Mabry cannot be prosecuted. He died before the investigation identified him, before any charge could be filed, before any courtroom could name what he had done. That absence of formal justice is a specific kind of grief that the family has had to carry alongside the reunion. And it is important to say so directly. Wyoming law enforcement has since used the Holt case as the basis for a formal protocol requiring all child disappearance cases from before 1980 to be reviewed under current genealogical DNA matching capabilities, with the first review cycle completed in 2024. 14 additional cases are currently under active reinvestigation. Harold Foss, who had retired in 1994 and who was 88 years old when the case closed, was contacted by Detective Bremner personally. She told him he had put the right name in the right file 56 years ago, and that it had mattered. He thanked her. He asked how the boy, how Isaac, was doing. She told him he had a sister and a family, and the other boot. Foss said that was enough. He meant it. Isaac Holt was 4 years old. He collected things, small things no one else could see the value of. A piece of quartz, a pheasant feather, a rusted bolt kept in his pocket because it felt like something worth keeping. He had a way of tilting his head to the right when he was thinking hard about something, and his grandmother called him her pocket philosopher. And somewhere in the life he was given. Without his consent, he grew up not knowing any of that about himself. He grew up not knowing his mother's name or his sister's face, or that there was a boot on a shelf 12 miles from the porch where he disappeared, sitting between the coffee can and the salt box, that a woman kept in her line of sight every single morning for 43 years. Ruth Holt did not live to see this. That is the fact that sits heaviest at the end of this story. But Isaac is alive, and he knows who he is now. And the boots are together. What does it mean for justice when the person responsible dies before the truth surfaces, when the record is the only punishment that can be served, and the record is all you have? What would you have done if you were Harold Foss? With one name on a list and no department support and no way to force the follow-through. And what do we owe to the people like Ruth Holt, who kept faith with a truth no one around them could prove, for decades, alone? Justice came for Isaac Holt after 58 years. Stories like his remind us that truth, however late, always finds its way to the light. If you believe that too, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. And if you want more solved cold cases, the links are waiting in the description. Thank you for watching.